All right, well, we will get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight, both in person and to those watching us online. We appreciate your enthusiastic support of our programs and your dedication to the Castine Historical Society. For those who haven't met me yet, my name is Kate McMahon, and I'm the new Executive Director of the CHS. I am wrapping up my first summer here in Castine, and I am very excited to welcome our speaker tonight. But first, a few housekeeping things. As a reminder, we have shifted to fall hours for the Abbott School, so we are open Friday, Saturday, and Monday from 10 to 4 and Sunday from 1 to 4. But we are willing to open up at other times if you have guests, so please email or call us. We are supporting the screening of the Rosenwald documentary, which will happen at Emerson Hall on the 7th at 4 p.m., which is a free event, which is going to be a really interesting documentary screening about Julius Rosenwald, who was one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck and who went on to help to fund schools in the South for African American children. So it's a really interesting story of philanthropy. And then in October, we will offer 2 walking tours of the Castine Cemetery led by Georgia Zildjian and Lisa Simpson-Lutz, our former executive director. Space is limited, so please sign up soon. On November 10th, we will be having a workshop with Dr. Riordon here again with the Wilson Museum from 4 to 6 p.m. That is also something we would appreciate RSVP for. I think that will be on the Wilson Museum's website. In a week or so. Yeah, very soon you'll be able to sign up for that. So keep that in mind. It will be a workshop, dialogic workshop. So please come. It should be a really interesting discussion and event around the semi-quincentennial and what does 1776 mean today. Looking further ahead, we will host our second annual Sip and Shop on December 10th at the Abbott School. Come join us for wine, cheese, and to browse our great Castine and Maine themed gifts. You can find more information on our website. We look forward to welcoming you all back in the spring as we open our new exhibition on the artist Francis Hamabi. We have some exciting programs in the works we think will entice visitors of all ages. So turning to tonight's program, I'd like to introduce Dr. Liam Riordon, who is a history professor at the University of Maine who specializes in the American Revolution. He is the co-editor of What We Know, What We Wish, Maine Statehood, Historical Commemoration, and the Urgency of Public History, forthcoming from UMass Press. Well, now it's out now. It's no longer forthcoming. That just was published by UMass Press in June. He helps to organize the National History Day in Maine, a statewide research contest for grades 6 through 12 students. He is also on the board of directors of the Great Pond Mountain Conservation Trust in Orland, the City of Bangor's Historic Preservation Commission, and the Collections Committee of the Wilson Museum. So please help me welcome Dr. Riordon.
All right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. It is a pleasure to be here. I have started giving a number of talks about the Declaration of Independence because of the 250th commemoration that's coming up. And the poll I circulated before the start of tonight's talk is something I haven't done before, but this sort of came up at the most recent event like this that I did. And I think this was a kind of interesting question to me. What do people feel is the general American society opinion about the Founding Fathers, and how does that relate to your individual feeling about the Founding Fathers? So I handed out this slip of paper with a sliding scale from total admiration being a 1 to total criticism being a 5. And I guess my suspicion was that maybe there would be a significant distance between what people felt their own opinion was versus what they thought the broader opinion of American society was. And in this group of Castine public history lecture goers, we have a pretty consistent view tending toward admiration, that your personal opinions are slightly more positive, a 2.11 average, thanks to Kate's calculation, but your sense of American society more broadly was 2.34 on average. So you feel like you're a little bit more positive about the Founding Fathers than the population at large, but not really a big discrepancy there, and pretty much on the positive side. So that's a kind of interesting context for me to think about tonight's talk, which does focus on the Declaration of Independence. Briefly, I'll just share, as Kate mentioned, I'm an early American historian at the University of Maine. I have been there since 1997, and the very first public talk I gave in the state of Maine was in this room in the summer of 1998. So whoever was at the Castine Historical Society in 97, 98 saw there was a new name on the History Department website, and they got me here after my first year of teaching. So very fun to be back here. And of course, it is a pleasure to connect with an audience in Castine, a town that has such a deep commitment to its history and the history of Maine, and such robust support for local cultural organizations. It's really a model for these kinds of activities throughout Maine, but also throughout the country. So I want to plunge into the Declaration of Independence and just start with the basics of this document. So it is usually understood as the start of the American Revolution. It has a strong association with the date of July 4th, 1776, as we see announced at the top of this most famous version of the document. And it clearly has an ongoing legacy that we feel in our present day lives. Most Americans try to celebrate it with family gatherings, fireworks, barbecues, and picnics. This is something that we share broadly in the United States, a sense of there's certain things you do on July 4th, and that, I think, is a good example of something that reflects a broadly shared aspect of American society. No matter where you live, no matter your religious, racial, ethnic tradition, July 4th is something that we share. And this does connect directly to the Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous documents in American history and one of the most influential political statements in world history. But notwithstanding this fame, the meaning of the document can be elusive, and even some basic facts about the Declaration of Independence are a bit confusing. So I have a three-part plan for what I hope to accomplish in my talk tonight. First, I want to talk a bit about how the past and the present relate to one another through historical commemoration. Secondly, I want to turn to talk about the context of the creation of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And then third, I want to look closely at the text of the Declaration itself, especially two contrasting portions of its structure. So this is the point where I set my timer. Because like most professors, I can talk and talk and talk. I've given all of that until now, I consider the preamble, so I don't start the clock then. But I am strongly committed to not going more than an hour. So if I go past an hour from now, my timer will go off and I'll bring it to a quicker halt. I am very happy to stop during the course of the talk and take questions, right? I think one of the hard things, if I blast at you for an hour. By the time that's done, no one will have the stamina to ask a question, or you'll forget. There'll be some point I made. You're like, I don't understand that, or I disagree with that. So if you raise your hand, even though it's a little dark in the back of the room, I will see your hand up, and I will try to finish the point I'm making, and we'll take a little break and do a little question and answer. I think that is a very nice dynamic for a public talk. So do not hesitate. If you have anything you want to make me pause for, please put your hand up and we'll take a little bit of a break. All right, so part one of the talk looks at the historic commemoration of the Declaration of Independence. And this is, of course, a very timely subject because 2026 will be the 250th anniversary of this significant moment. And indeed, for the next 5 or 10 years, there will be a whole series of 250th moments of commemoration around the American Revolution. This commemoration begins quite early in American history. This is, I think, the most famous image associated with the Declaration of Independence. It's a painting by John Trumbull, and I give it a kind of funny series of dates. He actually began working on this project in 1786, so just a couple of years after the Revolution was over, and he decided that he wanted to paint every signer of the Declaration from life. So he traveled all over the colonies. He even went to Europe to track down Jefferson and Adams, who were diplomats in Europe at that point. And that was the start of what was a small version of this oil painting in 1786. And then he gets a commission from the U.S. Congress in 1817 to do a grand, large-scale version of it that would eventually be hung in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, where it still stands today. So he actually paints 4 history paintings, 12 feet by 18 feet, that are in the U.S. Capitol building today. This is the most famous of that group. And it's a kind of interesting mission that Trumbull had in making this painting. In some senses, he was extremely painstaking. Like, it really mattered to him to do a painting from likeness of every signer. And if he couldn't, he copied other paintings that were done from a real likeness. And I think there are 6 men's faces who were obscured in this painting, and that's because there was no likeness of them, and he did not want to detract from the accuracy of his portrayal. However, he titles it July 4, 1776, and it is commonly assumed that this is the moment of signing of the Declaration of Independence, but neither of these is actually accurate. The July 4th presentation was done by Jefferson alone, and there was no signing done on July 4th whatsoever. So Trumbull is kind of combining aspects of the Declaration into a single iconic image. And this commissioning of the painting on the end of the War of 1812 was really a significant moment of national crisis in the U.S. The War of 1812, as residents of Castine know better than most Americans, was largely a failure for the United States. The Capitol had been burned. It was a real shaming. It was a moment when the Congress said, we really, in order to generate patriotism in the present, in the wake of the War of 1812, we need to look back to the glory and the success in the American Revolution and use that as a way to trumpet our success. So the commission is in 1817. The paintings actually get installed in 1826. So this is, of course, a 50th anniversary, its own sort of commemorative moment to install these large history paintings in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. And July 4, 1826 is also the date when the last two signers die on the same day, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Sort of an amazing coincidence of calendar and kind of dramatic symbolism. And this iconic image that I think is familiar to all of us has a lot of its power, not just from Trumbull's painting and its installation at the U.S. Capitol, but because it ends up becoming a mass-produced image. And so there are the earliest engraving of it by Asher Durand in 1820 is on the bottom left corner. And then there are many, many Currier and Ives versions all throughout the 19th century. It, of course, becomes the back of the somewhat ill-fated $2 bill. But in 1976, another moment of commemoration, this was the image that was used to cement this sense of the importance of the Declaration of Independence, the importance of that moment, July 4th, 1776, and its ongoing significance for United States history. So let's look again at the most famous and familiar version of the Declaration as a document. This, of course, has the prominent date at the top. It also emphasizes strongly that this was a unanimous decision. And then we have the iconic grouping of those signatures at the bottom, right? This is, I think, how we all imagine the Declaration of Independence in our mind's eye with this particular version. But what's interesting is that this version is actually an engraved facsimile that was made in 1823. And it was made that year for a very good practical reason. The original was already falling apart. And in 1823, the US government realized that this was an important document to how Americans understood themselves and understood their nation. And so they went to great pains to make a copy of it. So this is the original parchment version of the Declaration of Independence that is currently on display at the National Archives. And as you can see, it is basically illegible, right? All of those signatures at the bottom are basically gone, and even the super careful penmanship of that expert scrivener is begun to have gotten lost. So they made that decision in 1823, an act of preservation, also an act of commemoration, to save that particular version of what the document was. Now, this version was actually created by an order of Congress on July 19th. And it took about 2 weeks for the actual copy on parchment to be drawn up. And the signatures on that parchment copy begin to be signed on August 2nd, and actually take a couple of years until all the individuals sign the document. 9 delegates who were present at the Continental Congress in early July never signed the document. 2 men who did not vote yes in Congress later signed the document. And 8 signers were not in the Continental Congress when the vote happened to pass the Declaration of Independence. So it's kind of interesting. Our focus on the significance of the signers doesn't actually line up with the historical fact of when and how and who actually signed it. It's one of those legacy items that becomes significant later in time than originally. Now, that original parchment version of the Declaration has been on display in the rotunda of the National Archives since 1952. It is one of the Charters of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It was newly installed in the National Archives in 1952. It had previously been held in the Library of Congress for about 30 years. And before that, it was held in the archives of the Department of State and not really preserved or thought of as a document that people necessarily wanted to consult. Now, I think the significant thing about this space for the Charters of Freedom is that it presents the founding documents of the United States in a very abstract and religious context. I think this is clearly made to look like a shrine, right? The documents are in an altar. It's in kind of a hushed and silent space. It's kind of this grand open area that very much looks like a church. And I think this is really extremely far from the realities of the American Revolution and the political turmoil of July 1776. As the historian Pauline Maier has argued, the problem with this National Archives vision is that it communicates a sense of transcendent glory handed down by God and impossible to match founders. Again, in her view, rather than venerate the Declaration and the Founding Fathers, we need to participate in rituals of politics in order to be consistent with the meaning of the Declaration and the way in which it actually came into being. So the question for me, as I wrap up this first section of the talk, is how can we more accurately understand the era in which the Declaration of Independence was created than what is implied by this shrine-like setting created in the 1950s as a way to present the document. So I want to turn from these different moments of commemoration of the Declaration of Independence to think a bit about the year, the period in which it was actually created. And I think the starting point is a basic question, although it quickly leads to some messy complications. So we often think of the Declaration of Independence as the start of the American Revolution, but it's curious that it was approved by the Second Continental Congress. So something has already been underway before the Second Continental Congress gets to this moment. And the Second Continental Congress had met in this building, now known as Independence Hall, had been meeting there since May of 1775. So July 4th, 76 is a little bit of a late moment, perhaps, to think about the starting point of the American Revolution. So when did the American Revolution start? You know, a military historian would say, well, we've got to date it to April 1775. The battle begins at Lexington and Concord. There will be sustained warfare. The Continental Army has a commander-in-chief. That is clearly the start of the revolution in a military sense, even though the Declaration won't come for over a year later. I think I'm behind on my slide. There's my military history slide. So I'm going to move from that sort of broad point about the difference between the way a military historian and a political historian might think about the start of the revolution to drill a little deeper into the specific chronology of how the Declaration of Independence gets made. And this, I think, is one of the most basic ways that historians deal with evidence and try to make sense of a complicated past. We very simply try to put things in chronological order. If we understand the process by which things unfold in time, That will help us come to a clearer understanding of how such things are created. So the immediate chronology of the Declaration begins in the summer of 1776, and in May, the Continental Congress issues a call to the colonies that each one should start drafting a state constitution, that they should sever their connection to the empire, they should no longer think about themselves as a colony, they should define themselves as a state. So they have made this call before any kind of national statement by the Continental Congress on the behalf of the United States. And several colonies move very quickly to implement this. Rhode Island declares its independence in May of 76. They actually keep their charter of 1663 and just change it from Colony of Rhode Island to State of Rhode Island. Virginia, New Jersey, they also pass state constitutions before the Declaration of Independence that are intended to endure. And sort of interestingly to me, New Hampshire and South Carolina both draft state constitutions, but they specify that these are only during the conflict with Great Britain. They are anticipating a resolution of the imperial conflict, at which point they expect to go back to be colonies within the empire. So a lot of chaos, a lot of different sort of tempo is going on in different states in this period, now a full year into active warfare. But what will happen at the Continental Congress, and how will it push a new United States forward? So on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee, very influential Virginia delegate at the Continental Congress, calls for a resolution of independence. The Continental Congress agrees and names a committee of 5 to draft a potential constitution, declaration. So I've got the 5 portraits of the committee members on the bottom, Roger Sherman of Connecticut on the left, 3 famous founders in the middle, Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams, and then Robert Livingston of New York on the right. At the committee's first meeting, Jefferson was charged with the lead. He was the youngest delegate to the Continental Congress, and in a lot of respects had very little work to do. John Adams was on practically every committee of the Continental Congress. He was stretched thin, and I think that Adams also recognized that he was seen as a somewhat pugnacious and obnoxious person. It would be much more effective to have a young Virginian who was a strong writer be seen as the key person bringing this forward to the Continental Congress. So the committee worked on a draft for 17 days. It was largely written by Jefferson, but the committee did have quite a bit of input on it. And then it gets presented to the Continental Congress on June 28th. So let's turn now to what the Continental Congress does with this proposal that comes before it in July of 1776. The initial vote on July 1st, 1 vote per state delegation, led to a 9-2 vote, 9 in favor, but Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted against, New York abstained, and Delaware had no vote because it had 2 delegates in attendance, and one voted yes and 1 voted no. So the discussion continues. On July 2nd, there is another official vote for independence. 12 of the 13 colonies voted in favor of the independence motion. New York still did not join in this. But this was seen as sufficient, right? They did not require a unanimous decision. And so with 12 of the 13 colonies agreeing on independence, John Adams writes just amazing letter to his wife Abigail in Massachusetts to tell her about this extraordinary accomplishment. And I'm going to read at some length from this letter, in part because Adams has such a great way with language. And I also really love that he is both absolutely right in his sense of the significance of this moment, but also makes a kind of technical error because for him, July 2nd will be the great moment that is remembered and commemorated in U.S. history. So John writes to Abigail, July 3rd, 1776. This second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. So the vote has occurred, but the Continental Congress has not agreed on the exact language of the text of the Declaration. And so this is the next kind of key moment in the creation of the document. And by the end of July 4th, the Continental Congress, working as a committee of the whole, makes a number of fairly significant revisions to Jefferson's draft to come up with a final version that they approve. And then that version is sent to a printer to print as a broadside. That becomes the first public version of the Declaration of Independence. That is ultimately why July 4th is the day that we recall, because the text is finalized, it gets printed overnight on July 4th, and on July 5th, it begins to circulate. Now, what is interesting about that is that New York only agrees to support the Declaration of Independence on July 9th. And then the famous version of the document that we all know is one that is begun to be signed on August 2nd, that unanimous parchment version that we looked at before. So now we're down to part 3 of the talk, where we're going to focus more on the text itself. Yeah?
So what was New York objecting to?
Well, there were a number of issues. The Colonial Assembly, the Provincial Assembly of New York, had not authorized the delegates to vote in favor. So at just sort of a technical level, they were waiting to get permission from their state legislature, this provincial legislature, this kind of in-between. Are they a colonial assembly? Are they a state assembly? We don't really know. So that's kind of the technical answer. But the other huge overbearing issue is that by June of 76, the British Army has withdrawn from New England, and they are sailing to New York City. And this is clearly going to be the next military hotspot of the Revolutionary War. So if you're from New York and the British Navy, the largest armada of the 18th century is sailing toward the harbor of New York City, do you really want to poke your finger in the eye of that military? So that, I think, is the hesitation in New York. So let's turn then to this first actual public text of the Declaration. It's known as the Dunlap broadside. A broadside is sort of the social media of the late 18th century, a rapidly created, mass-produced, inexpensive piece of paper that could get posted on a wall, circulated by hand, read aloud in a tavern. So Dunlap, who is a Philadelphia newspaper printer, sets the type and prints this text through the night. And then on July 5th is the public release of this broadside. The president of the Continental Congress, John Hancock, mails out copies to colonial and state governments. He mails copies to George Washington at the head of the army in New York. We actually don't know how many copies Dunlap printed that night. Today, there are 26 surviving copies, and one of them happens to be at the Maine Historical Society. So they are actively working to circulate that to every county in the state of Maine in 2026. So hopefully it will come close enough to your house that you will get a chance to look at it. It is a large document, about 3 feet tall by 2 feet across, that lays out the basics of the Declaration to the colonial public for the first time in July of 76. Now, a couple of things look different about this version of the Declaration than the version that we're familiar with. And we see this in the title. It does not make a claim to be unanimous, right? On July 4th, you could not accurately or honestly make that claim, so that's not there. And then it also doesn't have all those signatures that we're so familiar with. Here we just have the signature of the President of Congress and the attestation of the Secretary of Congress. In fact, the Continental Congress will not publicly circulate the names of the signers until an edition of the Declaration is printed in January of 1777. They wait until a really significant military victory at Trenton and Princeton by Washington, because until that moment, it looks like the American Revolution is going to end very quickly. Right? The British completely destroy the Patriot troops at New York City. They roll across New Jersey with no problem. It seems like complete chaos and the war is over. And then there's this surprise counterattack, a dramatic victory at Trenton and Princeton. And it's only at that moment that the identity of the signers is made public alongside the Declaration of Independence. So I want to turn to two aspects of the text of the Declaration to take a closer look at. And we'll start with the famous opening. It begins with an explanation of why it is that this statement needs to be made. And this is part of the elegant preamble that is familiar to most Americans. And then it continues in the second paragraph to really communicate some of the most famous and idealistic political language of the United States. And so I think it's worth quoting this familiar language at some length. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So this is a very brief and powerful expression of the fundamental premises of American nationhood and of revolutionary idealism, that all people were created equal, that we all have inherent, inalienable, and natural rights, so rights that are not because we're Americans, but that these are something that we share as human beings. It expresses a commitment to limited government, that the government's purpose is only to protect that handful of rights. And finally, that the government gets its power and legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Thus, the people are sovereign, that they are the source of the government's legitimate power. Now, this revolutionary tradition represents the very highest ideals of American society, and it is a vision that has since inspired individuals resisting oppression throughout the world. This is really incredibly important, and these ideals have long been central to the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. This is the way the document is mostly understood today. But this famous section was not important nor much commented upon during the 1770s and 1780s. Only as the revolutionary generation passed away in the early 19th century, first with the rise of the anti-slavery movement, and then in Abraham Lincoln's hands, especially in the Gettysburg Address, did the transcendent idealism of the Declaration become central to its meaning in American history. So in this second paragraph that begins with this idealistic statement that we are all familiar with, this paragraph takes a sudden shift in tone to something quite a bit darker, to talk about abuses, to talk about tyranny, and to talk about the right to revolt. And this transition in the second paragraph then sets up a long list of statements about the abuses of power by King George. So if we, here I've got the digitized Maine Historical Society version of the Dunlap broadside on the left, and then they provide a typed transcript on their Maine Memory Network, so you can Google this and check out these different versions. And so I've boxed in red that sort of opening paragraph and the idealistic language, but then this much larger box in blue represents this list of evidence of abuses by the king. So in all, there are 20 he has statements that make up about 60% of the text. And it would be tedious to review every single one. Many of them are hard to understand. Many of them are, at the very least, overstated, and some of them are clearly not accurate. But I want to focus on the very last of these 20 he has statements. The list builds to a climax. This is really part of the rhetorical strategy of the 18th century. Like, to us today, we say, give them their big idea up front, right? It should be the first thing you say. But the rhetorical theory of the 18th century was you build. You start with the lesser ones and get up to your home run hit at the end of the list. So I want to look closely at this very final he has statement in the list of the abuses of the king. And it's a little bit confusing. This final and really most brutal accusation comes in two parts. First, it says he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. Now, to a 21st century audience, it's not really clear to us what the document might mean by domestic insurrections. But to an audience in the summer of July 1776, this was extremely clear. And it was a reference to a proclamation by the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, who had issued a public statement in November of 1775 that promised freedom to indentured servants or enslaved people whose owners were rebels, that if they fled their rebel masters and rallied to the British standard, they would be liberated by the British government. And a large number of enslaved people in Virginia take up this offer. They get known as the Ethiopian Regiment. They march under a banner that says liberty. And this was a tremendously threatening aspect of the early military conflict of the American Revolution. So this becomes one of the most villainous actions that is going to be listed in the Declaration of Independence. We need to declare independence because the enemy is mobilizing enslaved people to put down our political movement. The image on the right here is an example from a Loyalist newspaper that was sharing this public declaration by Lord Dunmore, Governor Dunmore, as signed in the bottom. And this is just sort of the most dramatic example of widespread fears throughout the colonies that the opening civil war among English speakers in the colonies is going to create the context that is going to allow for a rebellion of enslaved people to escape their bondage. Now, the final item on the list continues, right? He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Now, here, we need very little translation, right? This is bold and clear and on the face of it what this final statement of abuses, of alleged abuses by the king are. So he is mobilizing enslaved people. He is mobilizing indigenous people. Those are groups that are not part of our patriot political community. We need to unify and declare our independence in order to overthrow the abuses of the king, who has gone so far as to mobilize these other aspects of colonial society. Now, I connect it here with a political cartoon that was created during the War of 1812. Right? The War of 1812, again, as people in Castine well know, largely repeats the fundamental dynamics of the American Revolution, a very similar kind of conflict that would seem to be in many ways the capstone of the American Revolution, another conflict between English-speaking people in North America and the British Empire. And the title of this cartoon is the humane, in quotes, British, and their worthy, in quotes, allies, and shows, again, the same sort, a visual depiction of what we see in the language of that final clause of the Declaration of Independence. And so what I think is striking about this dramatic end of List of Abuses is that I think it does speak to a powerful message in American political culture that is born of the Revolution and that clearly persists into the War of 1812, and that I think is still with us in a lot of ways in the 21st century. This ongoing legacy in American political culture of excluding indigenous people and people of African descent from the political community of the United States. Now, I want to end with some concluding remarks, and hopefully we'll have a discussion and can return to some of these slides. And I think the real question for me, as I think about how do we commemorate the Declaration of Independence in 2026, how do we think about our connection to this political moment 250 years ago, is can we make space in our shared public memory today for both the idealism and the violence of the Declaration of Independence? The Declaration and the broader American Revolution which it symbolizes was a convoluted social movement that penetrated every facet of late colonial society. It was not made by Thomas Jefferson alone, nor even by the sole actions of the Founding Fathers. The revolution took shape around lofty principles, as well as a frightening exclusion of people of African descent and of indigenous people. And a commitment to exclusion was an important part of the broad mobilization that bound the Patriot movement together. Idealism and violence were central to the Declaration, to the Revolution, and to the ongoing political culture of the United States that persists to today. These contrasting elements are both part of our American political tradition, both have clear roots in the Declaration of Independence, and both need to be remembered as we commemorate its 250th anniversary in 2026. So this sort of returns me then to the sort of poll question I began circulating and that I already got some partial answers to. What is the right balance between admiration and criticism? What is the right balance between recognizing that idealism and its ambition to achieve more, while also recognizing this darker side of the revolutionary tradition that is a part of this most famous document as well? So, thanks very much. I appreciate your time. So I'm happy to take questions or comments. Yeah.
How did the Declaration become so paramount in our idealism and history compared to the Constitution?
So that's a good, so, we do have these two most famous political documents of the revolutions, the Declaration in 76, Constitution, a more complicated document, right? It's drafted, it takes a long time to draft it then takes a long time to ratify it then takes some time to amend it. So some of the difference is simply in the mechanics of that. Partly too, the Constitution is, does not have the same kind of idealism and lofty language. It's a longer document. A lot of it is technical. A lot of it is difficult to read. So I think those are some of the reasons for the differences. And I think partly as what interests me in the sort of first part of the talk, looking at that early commemoration with John Trumbull's images and the mass production of that signing moment, it clearly had an early resonance. And it also will have a real political power for later radical movements in the 19th century. So I just mentioned in passing that the first political groups that really turn to the Declaration and elevate that idealist language are members of the abolitionist movement. And they, famously, they saw, at least some of the faction of the abolitionists saw the Constitution as a compact with death. William Lloyd Garrison famously burns the U.S. Constitution as a way of dramatizing how it was a compact with slavery. So, the Seneca Falls document of 1848, the famous Declaration of Sentiments, takes the exact language of the Declaration of Independence and doesn't say all men, but men and women. So it's, part of the power of the Declaration is the way that it could speak to later generations and in multivalent sort of ways, in ways that, the Constitution, while incredibly important and really with a more immediate and practical application to ongoing politics, doesn't quite have that same drama and power. Yeah.
Can you tell us how the phrase pursuit of happiness gets into that document?
Right.
And we don't have the pursuit of property.
Right. So the direct language from Locke would have been life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And the change to pursuit of happiness is not really a radical innovation of Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. That phrase was also circulating in the late 18th century. But I think most people feel that Jefferson was aware of the duplicity of the document he was writing and being a slaveholder. And so to shift that language away from property, which would, of course, legally include the property of other human beings in this period, was a subtle but significant shift that is part of the elegance and the sweep and the drama of the broader claims that are made here. Great. Yeah.
That's not a question, but I know from experiences and interactions that while probably many people in this room didn't know of that last grievance, that most of the Indigenous folks that I know very much that is in the Declaration of Independence. That's something that they are very aware of and they use in multiple contexts in talking about their experience in nationhood. So an interesting thing to recognize that most of us don't know if that's there, but that most Indigenous folks do know if that's there.
Yeah.
In speaking to the difference between the Constitution and the Declaration is a radical statement of purpose. And its radicalness still bothers us today. The Constitution was designed to be a set of operating principles for the government in a reflection of what was said in the Declaration, but trying to put that into a context so that it could be administered with some practicality. And a number of the people who were involved in the Declaration were also involved in framing the Constitution. And they brought certain prejudices from the Declaration into writing the Constitution. So they're connected, but they're also quite separate in their purpose.
I absolutely agree. You know, the Declaration is a shorter manifesto, and it includes some very powerful language. The Constitution is longer, it's more technical, and it's really a set of rules for how the government is supposed to operate, so a little less inspiring. And I do think it's significant that the war itself is, of course, the great division between these two political documents. And so, the Declaration's work is to mobilize. It is to try to communicate a message that can be agreed upon by as wide a community as possible. And that is both some of the most idealistic hope of the Declaration, but also some of its most terrifying violence, that is what they felt was going to be the home run message. And I think by the post-war moment is a lot more cynical, that, it has been hard and a lot has been lost. And there was enormous awareness by the mid-1780s of all the ways that revolutionary idealism had fallen short. And neighbors hated neighbors, and you knew the person who profited off of the scarcity of food during the war. And so there's a more bitter sense of, how do we restrain power so that terrible things don't happen again? That really shapes the Constitution in different ways.
Question in terms of the unanimity of the Declaration of Independence, and that it was essentially reached, and that you speak of it as being kind of a motivating document, but and it, to me, it shapes the perception that there was this unanimous mentality in these colonies that were rebelling. But then I read a wide range of numbers about the reality of what the general population actually felt about, and relevant to Castine's history, what's the percentages of loyalists, patriots, loyalists, and just would rather not have a war at all?
So there's no question that the sides are badly divided, and the overwhelming majority of people are just hoping to weather the crisis, holding your family intact, not getting pulled in ways that you're going to be punished when things go out of control and something happens in another state or across the Atlantic and you end up paying the consequences for it. But I think that chaotic context is what does create the patriot need to try to come up with a document that will reach as broadly as possible. So I don't mean to say that it spoke to every single person and it worked for everybody. There clearly will be big divisions, and these will change over time, and they'll vary by different geographies. So it's a complicated question. But I think we do have a sense that the Declaration of Independence was effective in its rallying cry. And again, the thing that is haunting to me is that it does this in ways that we can be proud of and really value, but it also does this in ways that are disturbing and should bring us up a little bit short. And so how to reckon with both those things, I think, is the challenge of our current political moment. Yeah, okay.
I don't know if this is really a question, but I do think it's interesting that, it includes this last strong statement basically against Dunmore's proclamation, which, for those who don't know, more black soldiers fought for the British than fought for the Patriots because they promised freedom first. And eventually the United States did follow suit, or the Patriots followed suit, but later. Anyway, I think it's interesting that it includes the statement that is, and this conversation is happening in these patriot households where there are enslaved people, and it ultimately leads to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts because Elizabeth Thurman and Quock Walker are pulling these libertarian ideals into their arguments against slavery, which ends up abolishing slavery in Maine and Massachusetts. But there's just this multiple layers of irony and hypocrisy here around who freedom is for. And I think we continue to see that today, right? I mean, who is freedom for? Who is the United States for? And I think right now we're seeing that in a really large way about who is considered American and who is not.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what are your thoughts on, I mean, it's hard to project, right, to these founders, but the notion of or sort of originalist thinking, what would you think that this group of men might have thought about the veneration of this document as an originalist doctrine versus an idea of a changing political structure?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, so I quoted from the historian Pauline Mayer earlier in my talk, who has done a really super close examination of what were the political ideals circulating in the sort of 75, 76 that end up getting filtered through the Declaration of Independence. And the case that she makes very forcefully is that this was a grassroots movement that was going on in towns and local committees, and this local mobilization is really where the energy and the power of the revolutionary movement is. So, to the extent that the founders were part of that mobilization and were aware that that was really where the energy was coming from, perhaps they would have some pause to the veneration of this document. At the same time, I think a lot of the political leaders of the day were afraid of that energy and popular mobilization, and they worked hard to shape it and contain it and not have it go too far. And so, in a lot of ways, the most radical potential of the revolutionary mobilization is one that gets channeled and narrowed by successful political leaders who try to contain it. So, I think, for me, in the end of the day, the more you study the revolution, the more you have a sense of how messy and complicated it was, and just had many possible outcomes and different trajectories, not just the one that we are familiar with in the particular ways that we remember it through key documents like this.
Yeah, I find the date 1775 interesting because that was when British or English decided to deport the Acadians from Nova Scotia. And I was wondering, just a historical, why, because they were living there for 100 years, they declared themselves neutral, especially France and Britain were always at war, and they had cultivated the area and established themselves very successfully. And one governor suddenly one day came and gave them 2 weeks' notice to get out, and they started burning their homes. It wasn't like you could put your home on a barge and go someplace else. They burnt the place down. They separated the men and women, and they put them on different ships. And a lot of the places they went to, they were rejected from the colonies. Even in France, they didn't recognize them anymore because 100 years they spoke even differently. So I'm just thinking, I'm saying, well, why did the British at that point, they were pretty much a neutral group of people, why did they take such a decisive action to expel them in such a vicious way? And it's still commemorated today, Tintin Marie and all that. So, I'm just thinking as well, maybe the British, I'm thinking my thing, they saw what was going
So the Acadian deportation is an extremely interesting and important moment. It lasts for quite a long time, but the initial deportation is in 1755. So it's in the midst of what Americans often call the French and Indian War, what in Europe they call the 7 Years' War. And the great expulsion of 1755 that attempts to ethnically cleanse English Nova Scotia of French-speaking Acadians who had been there since the early 17th century, that effort really is done with a huge amount of participation and leadership by political leaders, merchants, and soldiers from New England. It is actually largely not a British effort. It is a colonial effort, and it is not really communicated to British authorities until it has already begun. And the biggest beneficiaries of the forced deportation of French speakers from the Annapolis Valley of contemporary Nova Scotia, the people who move in to that very productive farmland that had been diked and created by the Acadians are overwhelmingly from southern New England, where there's real land pressure and they've had having large families, but there's not land for your kids to move on to. And so this group is called the planters. The planters who arrive after the French speakers are pushed out are almost all from southern New England. So it's not, from my way of thinking, it's not actually something that's can appropriately be blamed on the British. It's really a kind of colonial endeavor. But it does, even though the biggest moment is in 1755, there are repeated waves of this, including during the American Revolution. And it is an extraordinary transatlantic diaspora that, of course, includes Louisiana and some groups going back to France. And it's a large-scale undertaking that is, save for Evangeline, the poem, is often forgotten in U.S. history.
Well, thank you all so much for So if you enjoyed today's discussion, please join us for a discussion group on November 10th at 4 o'clock at Wilson Museum. Sign up on the Wilson Museum's website in a week.
Thank you all.